deal about the then young Israeli state. I guess I should tell you that it was in the early 60s that I was at Brandeis. But I also learned to identify, along with many of my Jewish friends, with the struggle for Palestinian freedom. I mean, we were in the minority, but we argued then. This is in 1961. I'm telling you exactly when I was there. 1961 and 1962, that to challenge the colonialist, expansionist policies of the state of Israel was in the interest of global freedom. I find it so difficult to believe that, how many years later are we now? That's almost 50 years, so wow, that's a long time. I mean, almost a half century later, we're dealing with the same misperceptions, with the attempt to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. I want to tell you a little bit about that era. I guess I was asked to talk a little bit about the links between the anti-apartheid movement of the 80s and 90s and the struggle today. But I'd like to say that during that period, the 60s, the 70s, the struggles of the Palestinian people for liberation were always linked to the liberation struggles of people in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, and in the U.S. Now, I only have 11 minutes and 22 seconds, so I want to fast forward several decades. I want to fast forward to several decades when from the time I was in college to the period, that wasn't several decades, that would have been a couple of decades, when movements for liberation were in full force, inspired by the civil rights campaign of the 50s and the 60s, and by the struggles against colonialism in Africa and Asia, Latin America. What we know as the Black Power movement was a movement in solidarity with and inspired by the struggles for freedom all over the planet, including the ongoing resistance to the state of Israel. I mean, it was actually quite interesting as I came up to the third floor on the elevator. There was a young man, and I don't know if he's still here, and I forgot to ask him what his name was, in the elevator, who was talking to other students, and he says, I hear that Angela Davis was a member of the Black Panther Party. And one of the other students said, yeah, she was. And I looked at him and I said, hi. But during that period of the Black Panther Party and all of the other organizations, the American Indian Movement, the Young Lords, the Brown Berets, and so forth, there was a sense of connectedness with struggles that were unfolding, all over the world, including in Palestine. Colonialism and imperialism, we should know, are never satisfied with what they have. There is always a drive toward more. This is actually the logic of capitalism. You can never acquire enough profits, right? This is one of the reasons why we're in this terrible situation we're in now. Because the banks knew that when they were making loans, mortgage loans to certain in certain communities and to certain individuals, they knew that people would never be able to pay those loans back. But that's a parenthetical observation. I should get back to my notes and say that during the period when we in this country began to wage major and massive campaigns for political prisoners associated with the Black Panther Party, for example. And Mumia Abu-Jamal is a name that many of you should know, and if you don't know, find out about him. Political prisoners associated with the American Indian movement, and Leonard Peltier is the name that everyone here should know. Am I right? Is there anyone who doesn't recognize the name Leonard Peltier? Is there anyone, what? But during that period, we always acknowledged the connections between political prisoners here and political prisoners in South Africa, political prisoners in Turkey, political prisoners in Iran, and of course in Palestine, in Israel. You know, one of the most moving moments for me when I was in jail, I think Setsu told you that I spent some time in jail, and that I was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. You know, now that's like, you know, really a sign of honor now to have been on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. But I can remember when I was in jail receiving messages of solidarity from Palestinian political prisoners and feeling the closeness of our campaigns. And I should say this period also was the period that marked the beginning of the contemporary prison abolitionist movement. 1971, the Attica uprising. If you look at the demands that came from the Attica prisoners, they called for the abolition of imprisonment as the major mode of punishment. I'm proposing this genealogy, and I really don't have time to elaborate as much as I would like, because I think it helps us recognize how historically the movements we're discussing today were so closely allied. The anti-apartheid movement, which produced the strategy of calling for divestment, has now inspired the contemporary boycott, divestment, and sanctions for Palestine movement. During the divestment movement, or I would say in the aftermath of the boycott and divestment movement, Nelson Mandela stated that, and you should listen to this very carefully, Nelson Mandela stated that the massive divestment of the University of California was one of the most significant turns in the abolition of white minority rule in South Africa. Now, what does that tell us about what we might do today in terms of turning this divestment movement into one that may begin to spell the beginning of the end of apartheid in Israel? Because, of course, it was not only the University of California, it was many other universities that followed, it was states, it was cities that divested. But let me fast forward again. We're talking about the period of the 80s leading up to the early 90s, right? What about the turn of the century? And Andy has already talked about some of the things that happened at the World Conference Against Racism. Now, the problem that we should now recognize is that because the World Conference Against Racism happened in August and September, the beginning of September 2001, what else happened in September 2001, right? We never had the opportunity to really popularize what went on at the conference and to begin to develop serious strategies based on what happened at the conference. That work was hindered by the Bush administration's response to the